So the reason for this year is because of the reason why I want to do this year is actually it's the beginning of this week's portion that we talk about slavery, and it's quite incredible when you think about it. Slavery, we've just come from Mount Sinai. Last week's portion we talk about Mount Sinai. We talk about the giving of the Torah. And literally the first laws that the Torah discusses, there's a few short laws which are somewhat connected to the giving of the Torah that we mentioned at the end of last week's portion. And the next portion over, what did we start with? Laws of giving the Torah, of slavery. And it seems almost like if you were to look at it without seeing the bigger picture, and I always talk about this if anyone ever comes to shul, that if you don't see the bigger picture, you miss everything that's going on, really. When you're to look at it that way, you would see that it's cruel, it's wrong, like what's going on. On the one hand, we just spoke about the most incredible event ever to happen, spirituality being revealed in the most incredible way, and seeing all these godly revelations. What an incredible experience. And then straight afterwards, the Torah comes and tells us the laws about how to be a slave and how to treat slaves, etc. It seems almost like it seems wrong. But the truth is, and a lot of people forget about this point, they forget where the Jewish people are coming from. And this is the important point. The Jewish people have just been slaves for the last 210 years in Egypt. That's exactly where they've been. They've been slaves. Slavery, and they were going to be going to a place where they were going to once again a society which was going to be a slave-filled society. We know that when they left Egypt, they never took anybody as slaves. They never made anybody slaves. But by going and conquering the land of Israel, which was the plan at the time, they were once again going to have go into a society which was slave-filled. And how were they going to behave? This was the big question that was almost on the mind. So, if you step back for a moment, there's one answer that's famously given about the question of why this is given straight after the giving of the Torah, and like the first law the Jewish people get when they leave Egypt. The one answer is that, once you've gone through this incredible spiritual experience, the first thing that a person feels is like, oh, I'm beyond all types of issues, and I'm going to be the next Dalai Lama and the next great Rebbe. Who knows? I'm going to become the next great savior. And then immediately we lose that excitement and we fall back to our old selves. So the Torah is there to remind us that, you know what? Just take it easy. You may be inspired. It may be great, but you know what? You're still you. You still have your own issues. Calm down. And just remember, when you are faced with your own issues, remember that it's who you are. It's okay. You have traits which are not the greatest. It starts by talking about when a Jew steals and doesn't have the ability to pay back, and then in order to pay back, he's given over as, well, the word is an eved, but really what it means is he's given over as a worker, as an indentured worker, in order to be able to pay back that for what he's stolen. So really it's just a form of labor or work. But understanding that it's going to happen, you're going to steal, or some things like that will happen, and you're going to have to employ people, and how you're going to treat those people that you have to come across. Don't forget that you were also once slaves. But here's the interesting thing. The interesting thing is that we actually see halachically there's a difference between the way the Torah expects us to treat a Jewish person that becomes a slave and a non-Jewish person. It's a very different concept. So I want to start off by just looking at the early psukim so we know what I'm talking about. It's quite complex, but I'm going to show you some of the text. Okay, so you can see my screen. Hi Irene, welcome. Look at my screen. It says, this week's portion we start off with the following laws. These are the laws you place before him. What happens? It says like this: when you will acquire a Jewish servant, it tells us Sheish Shanim Yavod. He will work for you for 7 years. And he will only work. He has to go free in the 7th year. Okay. Now it talks about if he comes and he's married, and he ends up in the time having another. You want to give him another servant to cohabit with, etc. Now then it also talks about if he decides he doesn't want to go free, and how you treat that person. You take him to the door, and when you take him to the door, you pierce his ear. And why do you do that? And this is an important point. I want to show you like this. It said that he goes through after. What happens if the servant says, Adoni, I love my master. Ves ishti, so the wife that I gave him, that you gave me a spona, and therefore lo yitzei chofshi, I don't want to go free. So it says like this, and this is an important lesson. This is an important pasuk. It says v'yigisho adanav le'olokim, then you bring him to the judges. V'yigisho ladelet olam mezuzah. You take him to the door, or to the mezuzah, or the doorpost. V'ratza adanav et azno b'martzeya, and the master shall bore a hole in his servant's ear. V'avado le'olam. And then he shall be your servant forever. Now, if you don't look at Rashi, you'll already struggle with what's going on over here. Now, there's massive long Rashis because everything over here is very ambiguous. For those of us that study the Rashis these days, it really gets carried away over here and takes a long time. But it's fascinating stuff. It's just fascinating when we study and we try to divide a study course, and some days it could take you an hour to study, and some days it takes you 5 minutes. But there's a certain connection between each day and that particular tract, that particular portion. Okay, so this was actually Sunday's portion. So it tells like this. You bring him to the Beth then. Why? Because they were the original ones that gave him to you as a servant, because you paid for what he had stolen. Now he's brought to the door. Okay, I'm not going to get that's just a grammatical problem. And it tells us what is happening to him. And then it says, V'avodo le'olam, it tells us he will serve you once ad le'olam, only till the Jubilee year, the 50th year. So Judaism works in cycles of 7 and 50s. Every 7 times 7 is 49, and then the next year, every 7 cycles of 7 years, we have 50. That's the Yovel year, just like the giving of Torah was 7 times 7 days, and then the 50th day was the giving of the Torah. Okay, so just on a basic point, it tells us that he'll only work temporarily. Now, just to pause for a second and understand, why is it that if the servant, the Jewish servant, I haven't got to the non-Jewish servant because I want to also talk about the non-Jewish servant. I think it's important to understand this difference. The Jewish servant cannot work for a Jewish person forever. And if he's only supposed to work for a max of 6 years, and if he decides, if he himself chooses at his own volition that he wants to work for longer, what happens? He's taken to the doorpost, and over there he has a hole made in his ear. So we're told why. And I didn't get into all the commentaries over there. Why is it? Why is this happening? He says, because just remember where you're coming from. You just came from being servants to the Egyptians. You were real slaves of it. That was really bad slavery. You were tortured. You were made to work the worst possible ways. And then God came and He freed the Jewish people. I freed you. And then He said, Li Yisrael Avadim, the Jewish people now will become my servants. And He, so to speak, by freeing us, He, so to speak, acquired us, and we accepted to be the servants of God, to serve God, to indenture and give over our lives to the service of a higher purpose, to God's purpose in the world, to give ourselves over to the purpose that God had created us for in this world. And by going and stealing, you went against that. And then by being a servant, you're also going against that. So God says, you know what? You went against me by stealing. Okay, so I'll give you a way out. You be a servant for a certain amount of time. But then when you willingly choose to go and be a servant to somebody else, and when you're a servant to somebody else, you may not be able to serve me properly, and you've already committed. The Jewish people in last week's portion, they just committed to serve God properly. That was the commitment that we had made. By doing that, you've gone against who you are, a servant of Hashem, a servant of God. And that's why a Jew cannot be owned long-term by another person, because you're already owned by somebody else. You can't steal somebody else's servant. A Jew is already a servant to God. We're there to serve that higher purpose. Okay? So that's the important thing to remember. God freed us, but we're there to serve God. Now, I want to pause for a moment and think about this. There's a lots of laws about how a Jewish servant is treated and how a non-Jewish servant is treated. I'm going to get how a non-Jewish servant is treated. They're similar but not exactly the same. Both of them have to be treated properly. And we'll look at the laws in Maimonides in a moment for a non-Jewish servant. The difference is that a non-Jewish servant is able to be a servant for life or a slave for life, while the Jewish person can't. Now, why is that? Because the non-Jewish person never pre-committed to another master. He hasn't already committed to God and said, I will, has not already committed their life to the higher purpose. Not only that, by becoming a servant of a Jewish person, in order for a non-Jewish person to become a servant, for a servant as in the title of an eved, a worker, if you look at it, when you look at the description of what it actually means, it's almost like a laborer, a worker. But the difference is he lives in the parent into the owner's property. The owner is obligated to take care of him. He doesn't necessarily get a regular salary, but all his needs are taken care of, plus the needs of his family are taken care of. And the owner could keep him there, or he's supposed to stay there for the rest of his life. But the thing is, it's not a full ownership of a human being. The owner cannot abuse that person. So when it comes to a Jewish servant, the owner is not allowed to abuse the Jewish servant. Not only that, we're told that they're not allowed to cause them to do certain labors are forbidden. You cannot cause a Jewish servant to do certain labors. And what's the reason for that? As I mentioned, because it's understood that as a Jew, you understand that this person is already the servant of somebody else. He's God's servant, so you can't really abuse that person. You're just having him temporarily for him to pay back what he took. However, the non-Jewish servant, he's not already a servant to somebody else. He's a man that has become a servant, and we'll talk about how can a non-Jewish person even become a servant. We know how a Jewish person can become a servant. But what's more complicated in Judaism is how can a non-Jewish person become a servant? which I'll get into a moment, because what's the problem? We know that one of the 10 commandments is you're not allowed to kidnap. Lo tignov, do not steal, is not to kidnap. So you can't kidnap. You can't just go and take people. So how would Jewish people in the first place acquire slaves? There's only really one or two ways, which wouldn't be practical in the last over 2 millennia, more or less. So we have to face the ethical question of slavery, which is almost like the elephant in the room when you're talking about slavery. How could the Torah have allowed for such a thing? But first, you have to understand what it means to be a slave, and really, to a certain degree, once you understand how the Torah looks at slavery and what it allows, you'd see that it's not at all the slavery that they had in the United States, for example, before abolition. It's not at all anything like that. Why? So this is what I want to show you. I'll show you another. I'm a little bit all over the place today. I apologize for that, but I'm hoping that when you get to questions, everything will come clear. If I miss something out. So what I wanted to show you now is later on in the portion, this week's portion, it also talks about the Eved Knani, the non-Jewish slave. Now, it says over here in the non-Jewish, we're looking about non-Jewish servants, and I want to talk about first and foremost what does the Torah allow us to do, and what are we supposed to do? In old times, when there was still this concept of slavery, and by the way, unfortunately, slavery still exists today in certain parts of the world, but in most Western countries, it's extremely frowned upon. Thank God. But nevertheless, let's look at it. It says like this. It says, I don't know, like the word excruciating, but it says you're allowed to cause your Eved Kanani, your Canaanite slave, to work for you very hard, to do real labor for you. So it says like this, that's what you're allowed to do. Now that was something that we said you weren't allowed to do for a Jewish slave, and I explained the reason why the Torah doesn't allow that for a Jewish slave, because it's not really, you could never really truly have that you're taking somebody else's slave from a Torah's perspective. He says, Afalpi Shadin Kach, nevertheless, even though that the law, that's sometimes the Torah allows something as just like that's the way it is, but not the recommendation, far from the recommendation, says the Torah, says Rambam. He says Midas Chasidus, the true way of how a person should act. And not only is it Midas Chasidus, he says, Midas Chasidus is the pious way and the correct way of behavior. But he says, V'derech Chachma. I want to actually pause for a moment. We always refer to Maimonides, and it's almost like Rambam. Why are we always going back to Rambam? Right? And, why don't we just go straight to the Torah, or stick with the Torah, or stick with the Mishnah, or Shulchan Aruch. The truth is that a lot of these laws that don't apply in times of exile, the only one to clearly write about them was Rambam, was Maimonides. So therefore, if we want to go through, sometimes it's quite clearly written about in certain Mishnah or Gemara, but in a very strategic fashion, the only one that properly writes about it would be Rambam. So what does he say? He says the correct way to behave with them, and the smart way, is that you should be merciful. Adam Rachman, v'rodev tzedek, and you should chase after righteousness. V'lo yichbid oloi al avdoi, and do not make it don't work them too hard. Don't lo yotzelo, don't pain him. And then he says v'yachliyehu v'yashkehu mikol ma'achal mikol mishta. And then he says you're supposed to feed him and give him to drink of every food and every drink, whether you're serving the delicacies, wine and meat. You should always give them the best food and drink. Now, and he says that what we have recorded, and the Talmud goes into this and talks about many stories of scholars that actually owned a non-Jewish servant. So you would, if they were around, and if we had statues of them in today's day and age, of course they would be torn down because they owned a servant. But the difference is, if you look at they treated them as like, it was almost like a partner, as a friend. It says the Chachamim Arishonim, if they had someone that worked, it was like they worked for him. Are you not nim? Not they didn't just like say, you know what, you work for me, I'll give you a paycheck. No. They gave their servants mikol tavshil v'tavshil shoyochlin. Every single food that they ate, they gave to the servant. And not only that, they would first make sure that they took care of the needs of their servants and their animals before they fed themselves. So they treated them better than they treated themselves. Harehu omer, but he says, avodim al yad adonehem. We said this in our davening on Shabbat, and this is from Tehillim. Like the eyes of servants on their masters, so to the eyes of a maidservant on his mistress, on her master. Okay, and therefore he goes on to explain: don't abuse them, not emotionally, not physically, not to get angry at them, not to scream at them. Always talk to them nicely. And then it goes on, he says, even in Job, the Torah gives us in Job a clear thing, and he says one of the things when he gets all these terrible things happening to Job, one of the things he says, Emes mishpat abdi v'amasi beriva mimadi. Did I ever, I was looking in the English, I ever shunned justice for my slave and manservant when they quarreled with me? Did not he who made me in the belly make him? It talks about how we're equal. Was it not the one who prepared us in the womb? In other words, he's showing that at the end of the day, he's also a human being. And therefore he's teaching us how to treat another person, even if you feel. And therefore he says only ones that serve idolatry or other nations, they can think that, oh, they own this person, they've paid money, or they whatever own another person, and therefore they can treat them however they want. But he says the servants, the children, the descendants of Abraham, and those are the Jewish people, he says that he gave us the Torah, and he gave us mercy, and we should, he says, and then he says something fascinating. And also the attribute of God. And God commanded us that we should follow in his way. And like it says, that God is merciful, it says that anybody that is merciful, we should have mercy on them. And therefore he goes on to tell us he will show mercy, he will show you mercy and be merciful upon you and multiply you. So what's he telling us? These last words are very important. He's telling us that from a strictly Torah law legal perspective, if you make your servant work hard, you can say, you can justify it from a law perspective. This is a non-Jewish servant, right? But he says that's not the way that Torah taught us. Torah may not say that you cannot work them hard. Torah doesn't say you can't work them hard. It only says it about the Jewish servant. But it tells us how we should treat them. And it commands us that you should treat them with mercy. You should treat them better than you treat them as part of your family. Take care of all their needs before your own needs. If you think that by owning a servant, it says in the ethics of our father, didn't open over here, what does he say over there? Hakoine eved, something that acquires a servant, kikoine rav la'atzmai. I think the word is rav. If somebody acquires a servant, it's as though he has acquired for himself a master. Because the way the Torah expects you to treat that person would be as though you were treating them like a master. Now, we know that the Torah also tells us this. In certain ways, we are expected to treat the non-Jewish servant greater than even the Jewish servant. Because we know that the Torah may say that you're allowed to cause your non-Jewish servant to do real labor, hard work for you, because somebody's got to do it. Or you can get a Jewish person to work for you and just pay them, but not as a servant. If they're your servant, you can't do it because the Torah has a special caveat that protects the Jewish servant because they're already the servant of somebody else, but not the Jewish laborer. If you wanted to pay them the top bucks to be the guy that, you know, does bricklaying or whatever it is, you could do that, but you can't do it to your servant. But the non-Jewish servant, you could do that to. But the Torah says, and this is Torah law, and I just couldn't find it. I think it's the next chapter on, but I'll just go show you to you quickly. It says, sorry, it was in the next chapter. It tells us further. Oops. Okay. So I'm just looking for one thing. Okay, actually, for those that have actually studied the laws of servitude in Maimonides, they're quite fascinating laws. But it tells us, for example, that if a person owns a non-Jewish servant and they abuse them. Now the Torah doesn't want to say abuse is a very generic word, right? What's abuse? You know, it could be, the Torah tells us, be merciful on them, treat them kindly. And then the rabbis learned out, you feed them first, you act nicely with them. But the Torah gives us like almost like limitations. If you get angry at your servant and you whip them and you cause a part of their body to be lost, to be ruined, the servant goes out free. If you knock out their tooth, the servant goes out free. If you cut off the tip of their finger or the tip of their breasts or their something part of their body or tip of a body part is knocked off or cut off, whatever it is, then the servant goes out free because you don't have the right, you don't own their body in that sense. You don't have the ability, it's not your to do whatever you want. And that's something that was fundamental, and that's Torah law. So this was something that was fundamentally different to the way that the rest of the world looked at servitude. Okay, so we're still left with two major questions. Question number one, which is really why I wanted to bring this, is why is the Torah talking about this exactly now, straight after giving the Torah? So I said because the Torah wants to remind us of how to be good human beings and also remind us how low we can sink. Just because we've been inspired, and we know that 40 days after the Torah was given, the Jewish people sunk to a new low with serving the golden calf. That's one element of it. But the other one is the importance of understanding how Judaism fundamentally is really a fight against slavery. And this is the main point. So I really want to talk about this. The truth is, I spoke about this a few weeks ago, an element of this a few weeks ago, but it once again reappears over here. Judaism's about fighting against slavery, and there's all different types of forms of slavery. But before I get to that, I want to talk about more the ethical question that we have. In today's generation, when we talk about abolition and slave, in today's world, the world that we stand today, owning another person in any form or matter is looked at as being totally immoral. Right? So the big question is, how can the Torah allow another person to be owned? Or even the ownership of slavery? So people will say, well, the answer is that the Torah is saying that if you're going to own them, just treat them well. So the truth is that there's several ways of how different people have answered this question through the generations. Even some of these answers even predate the abolitionists, and all the civil rights movements and all those type of things. Some of these people wrote about this way beforehand, and the Torah and the Talmud, which was 1600 years ago, was already asking questions about slavery and how it works.
In many cases, you're doing the slave a favor. You're giving them a better life. In many cases, people need that more than being out on the street or having no food.
Right. Okay, good. 100%. So that's there's a few approaches of to the ethical question that have been posed by Jewish thinkers throughout the years. I was going to pose one or two of them. I've already explained to you just the background to the question before you even ask the question. You have to understand that it's totally different to what people understood slavery in the first place, to what was going on in the world at large with slave ownership. It was a totally different thing within the Jewish world. And once you understand that, now we can look at the approaches of how even that was allowed. The Torah should have just said, you can't own a slave. Right? Just you can't own a slave. You can't own another person. Full stop. Okay, Yochanan, do you want to say something?
I was going to ask you, I mean, the word slavery, it's a way of, you could put it another way, indentured labor, more indentured than slave in the modern terms. Was there really, what we believe as slavery, like we imagine in those times, slavery had a different meaning, maybe, and maybe we better interpret it as indentured and not actually slaves.
Right, 100%. And the answer to your question is, and your point is very correct. The basic answer to the question is, how could the Torah have allowed slavery? And the answer is, the Torah doesn't allow slavery. In the way the Western world, the world understood slavery, that concept of slavery is not allowed by the Torah. Full stop. There is no allowance to own a person and to abuse them and to treat them as cattle or whatever it is. The Torah never allowed that. Look at the law. If you abuse or you hurt your slave in a certain way, your slave goes free. If you have a slave, you've got to treat them better than you treat yourself. You've got to treat them like a family member. So the concept, it was really about taking care of an individual. So I'll just so the first thing is that there was historically there was two times that there's two ways that a Jewish person can own a slave. As I mentioned, there were certain times, like the Anglo-Saxons, they went to parts of Africa, and I don't know all the history of slavery that well, but they would go to parts of Africa, they would find a bunch of African people, tie them up, put them on a boat, and bring them to America or wherever it was, to Europe, and made them into slaves. That's literally kidnap. That's 100% against Torah law. There's no it's not against Torah law. The punishment for that is murder. It doesn't make a difference if the person's Jewish or not, from the way I understood it. Okay? So how would you find a slave? So the answer of how you can get a slave, there was one exception. Sometimes when you went and you conquered a land, and there was one land that we were allowed to conquer in such a way, was the land of Canaan. And if you conquer the land of Canaan, and there was somehow people that stayed over, and they wanted to remain in the land, then either they could live and become part of the Jewish people, or live as what was known as a ger toshav, that they accept upon themselves the law, and sometimes they accepted and somehow became your slaves. But you weren't allowed to kidnap them or whatever it is. And there was the story of Midian, where we had to, because of the way they came to war against the Jewish people, what they called, God says, I want you to destroy the men and certain people, then certain ones of them you can take as your slaves. So that was an exception. And the other exception was when they conquered the land of Israel. But since then, there was no other way of a person going up to another person and just getting a slave. There was no such possibility. So the other way that you can get a slave was by trying to, when slave traders, when you saw somebody, you saw your Gentile neighbor had a slave and was mistreating them maybe, or there was a man that came with a boat and they were selling these people, and you had mercy on them, and you knew that the best life that these people could have was if you bought them as a slave and you paid that extremely exorbitant price for them, and then you brought them into your family and they would work for you. And if you were going to do that, you were going to have to treat them in the way that we explained. So it was almost like a salvation for these people, because if they would remain in that servitude, then it would have been a dismal, terrible, real slavery life. And by you serving them, so the Torah doesn't expect you to go and pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's value to free another man, slave or whatever, to buy a slave of the market, and then just say, now go free. Because that person would probably just end up back in the same place where they were. They wouldn't have a way to take care of themselves. So it wouldn't be good for that person. And also, most people in their right mind wouldn't be able to afford just to go around freeing slaves. But the Torah says, okay, you can free that, or you can buy the slave from the non-Jewish person. But they know that when you do that, you're going to be treating them, the condition that you treat them like you would treat your own family. Okay, so that's the one element to it. So that's actually one of those answers that was brought by a famous German rabbi known as Reb Samson Raphael Hirsch, and he already wrote this answer in the 1800s, in the mid 1800s, which is around the time of the abolition. He was answering this, how the Torah. Then there's another man by the name of he's got a book named Mahmone Uziel. I couldn't find the text online, so I apologize for that. He says he was Rabbi Ben Seal Uziel, and I'm trying to see if I find anything. He lived in the the early 1900s, and he was a Sephardic chief rabbi in Israel from 1939 to 1954, and he writes about this concept. He says that the reason why they permitted slaves is also, once again, to save people from the cruel treatment. Because when you saw another person, a Jewish person, we said the Jewish person are rachmanim. God tells us, as I showed you in Maimonides, it says to be merachim, to have mercy. And when you see somebody else is being amused, you're going to have this desire to be merciful. And therefore, as a way of mercy, the Torah allows you actually to buy them, to be merciful for them. Now, how do we know that? Because the Torah tells us that you once you owned a slave, you weren't allowed to sell the slave over to a non-Jewish person. Why? Because there's a fear that he would be abused, because that non-Jewish person has no Torah law which makes him abide to certain laws. So you weren't even supposed to sell him over to another Jewish person, but if you did, that was one thing. But if you sold him to a non-Jewish person, then you had to pay up to 10 times the price to buy him back. So you could buy him, but you're not allowed to sell him, because once you buy him, you've done that as his own protection, and now you have no right to sell him over in a possibility where he may become abused and get abused and maltreated. So, and he goes on to explain that the difference was that the Jewish people, if they conquered when they went to the land of Israel also and they got slaves, they took them from the Canaanites that were mistreating them and abusing them, and acted with them with kindness and passion. And therefore, the reason why the Torah actually allowed slavery or servitude is more like it wasn't allowing slavery. The Torah says slavery in the way, because we don't allow the old style of slavery where you take someone and you own them and you can do whatever you want with them, whip them and abuse them and do. So therefore the Torah says you can't do that. But you see somebody else that's being enslaved, you can then go and buy them and treat them well. and make them part of your family, and make sure you take care of these things. And no, you can't. You can't sell them. As a matter of fact, as far as we know, there's no recorded any stories of Jews mistreating their servants, their slaves. And we know that, as we mentioned from the Mishnah and the time of the Talmud, all those slaves, there's a story of how, where is it brought? Somewhere in the Talmud, where one of the rabbis wanted to free their slaves to do a particular service, and the non-Jewish slave refused to go free. And often those slaves would study Torah. There's a famous Rebbe, I think it was one of these, or Rabbi Gamliel. One of them had one of the famous rabbis had a servant called Tevi, and the Tevi was so important part of the family that when he passed away, the rabbi sat shiva for him. And it says, and the Mishnah asks, but generally we don't sit, even though you're supposed to teach him, treat him so well, but to sit shiva for him like a family member. He says he was different. He became a scholar, and he became like a partner and a brother, and he was mourning the loss of his close companion. And that's the way they treated them, and that's the way they advised that if you were going to take this person, it wasn't a person that you're going to say, okay, now free labor, I don't have to pay workers anymore, and that's why I do it. No, the opposite. You was going to be taking someone. It was like adopting a person into your family, and that's why, in order for that non-Jewish slave actually to stay with you, the first thing that they had to do is they had to accept to do some of the mitzvot, because now they were becoming part of your family. They actually had to be if it was a male, they had to agree. They had to willingly be circumcised. You couldn't force them, and then you also had to make them immerse in mikveh. They did a half of a conversion ritual. They actually did a full conversion ritual in order to make them into that slave. And if they refused to do it, and then they were obligated with the same mitzvot that a Jewish woman is obligated. In other words, because they have certain commitments, the Torah didn't obligate them like a Jewish man. They didn't have to put on tefillin, but they had to eat kosher, they had to keep Shabbos. Right? And if you did free them, then they didn't just go back to their old lives. That was the end of their conversion. They became a full-fledged Jew, and they can go and now marry another Jewish woman. Or if it was a maid servant, they can go marry a Jewish man. So you see, when you look at it from the bigger picture, you see that this wasn't slavery. This was making a person a part of your family. No, it wasn't just adopting them. It was actually, they had to willingly become Jewish like you. And you couldn't force them to do it. It was, he's saying, you'd go up to a person, I know you've been abused and you've been mistreated over here, come, you can join our family, we'll make you, but you're going to have to become Jewish if you want to do it. And they had to accept that, because being part of your family, that's what it meant. So you see, when you look at all these laws, you say, oh, this is not service, this is not slavery. This was another person that you were basically adopting. Yes, they were going to have responsibilities, and they were going to maybe work more than the responsibilities, but just responsibilities like any other member of the family, almost. Okay. So when you look at it from that perspective, it seems quite... There's another perspective which we run out of time, which almost... I don't know if I really want to focus on... There's another rabbi, I'll just mention it. His name is Rav Nachman Eliezer Rabinowitz, and he says that all people are, the Torah taught us the concept of people being created equal, and therefore we have to treat all people equally. But nevertheless, the Torah understands that some people, they see what's happening in the world and they feel like they can act like the rest of the world, and therefore the Torah doesn't always expect people to be perfect human beings and say, oh, the ideal, the Torah tells us the ideal is that there's no such concept of slavery. But the Torah says, okay, so you can look around the world and say, hold on, everybody else has a slave, why can't I? So therefore the Torah says, okay, if you're going to need the concept of slavery somehow, we'll allow for it, but understand that it's not going to be the same type of slavery that the world is having. It's going to be somebody that you're going to have to treat really well, and that it's going to be a very different type of person and way of being treated than the rest of the world has it. In other words, the difference between the second approach is, the first approach is, it was actually a way of almost rehabilitating these individuals and adopting them and taking them on after all the what's been almost like saving them in the way of salvation. That was the one approach. The other approach is that the Torah, it's not necessarily about a salvation for them and saving them, but it's the Torah acknowledges that people have these inclinations and they also see the slavery around the world, so the Torah will allow you to do it, but not in the same extent. And the Torah tells you, you're not at the level that you're able to stop slavery straight away, but nevertheless we could allow it, but understand that no, you can't abuse that person, and no, you can't mistreat them. So it's almost like so much of a defensive or a apologetic approach. That's what it seems like. But once again, if you look at Maimonides, he looked at it totally different. He says it's all about mercy and taking them. Now, I didn't want to focus on that approach, because if you look into that approach as well, you'd see once again it's very similar to the first approach, which is that no one should be a slavery and must be treated and abused. And therefore, if you had an opportunity to save them, really that's what you're trying to do. You may look at it as though, oh, I'll get benefit out of this person, but ultimately you must understand that you're there to help and benefit that individual. It's just a difference in the perspective of where the buyer, so to speak, the Jewish buyer, was coming from. Okay. Now there's one final question which I wanted to discuss, which is what I've been talking about the whole time, which is, why does it happen straight after the giving of the Torah? And why does it discuss it straight after the Jewish people have just come out of Egypt as they themselves being slaves? So, as I mentioned at the beginning or earlier, the whole concept of Judaism really is one major fight against slavery. Slavery has many different ways of how people look at it. But the truth is that the greatest slavery that we have is to our own inclinations. And we started off by being slaves to the Egyptians in Egypt. That's who we started off by being. But if you look at it for a moment, you'd see that it goes before that. How did the Jewish people end up as being slaves in Egypt? Because of a young man named Joseph who was sold down as a slave, and he found his way free, and he never allowed himself to be incarcerated or brought down or traumatized or impacted by what he had gone through. And in every situation that he found himself, he always rose above it. And Joseph went there and taught us what the purpose of the slavery in Egypt was, and what the purpose of Judaism almost is. That you'll go down and you may be sold, and your brothers may have sold you and kidnapped you, and you may then have libels against you that people say that you try to rape them and it's false, and then you get thrown in prison. And in every circumstance, what happens to Joseph? I'm sure he wasn't happy that his brothers had sold him. We know that he wasn't. And then when his master's wife accuses him of rape, of course he's not happy, and he gets thrown into prison, slavery prison. You can imagine how bad that is. But in each circumstance, he always never allows himself to become incarcerated by that. He never allows himself to become a slave. He always rises above it and rises to the top, and it doesn't prevent his success. And this was the image that the Jewish people had when they came down to Egypt. Who did they see? They saw the viceroy, the leader of the second most powerful man, but also the man that had saved much of the world at the time from destruction. This is Joseph. They would have all died in starvation and famine if not for Joseph, this poor slave boy that had been sold by his brothers and made into a prisoner, had risen to the top and saved the world. And the Jewish people then come down to Egypt and they themselves become slaves. And once again, when they come free, when they get redeemed, they're told that you were made to be a slave in order to show you that, yes, we could be a slave to other people. But that's not who you are. Ultimately, no matter what situation you find yourself, you will have the ability to overcome any type of restrictions that other people put on you. But more importantly, any type of situations that you find yourself. Because you are, by having been slaves to Pharaoh, and then by God having freed you, you now become the slaves of God. And the servants of God doesn't mean that God once again abuses us. No, it shows that God is all merciful and cares about us, but also shows what God sees in us, that incredible, immense potential, yeah. That the infinite possibilities of what we have the ability to become, and that slavery could never take away from us, and that we, in trauma and abuse and life's circumstances, never has the ability to take away our true and inner freedom. One of the Chabad rabbis, and it probably wasn't said just by one of them, it was said by many of them. I think famously the Friedrich Rebbe, when he was taken into prison for wars against the communism for spreading Judaism, and they tried to get him to do certain things. He said, you may have put my body in jail, but you could never put my soul in jail. You could never incarcerate my soul. And this is really the story of Judaism. The story of Judaism, that the Jewish people, as soon as they receive the Torah, they tell you, what's the first message afterwards? Yeah, you have all types of inclinations. You may fall down and you may, just because you've been inspired, yes, you also have your own issues and constraints and your things that bog you down and your own animalistic drives and desires and pleasures which could be damaging to yourself and to others. But know that you could never be a slave. That even if you find yourself incarcerated or tied up by your own issues or by somebody else's issues, you always have the ability to rise up against that. And that's what it means to be an anointed people, a mamleches kohanim and servants of Hashem. That you have the ability, no matter what the circumstances, to rise above and overcome that. And nobody can hold you as a prisoner. Nobody can hold you a captive. Because you are my servant. You have already been given over to me. And I have given you the strength and the power to rise above. And just like Joseph, when he was got down, and having been sold as a slave and a servant, he found his way up. And he never allowed his circumstance to overcome him. So too you as the Jewish people. By having received the Torah, by having come out of Egypt, you too will find yourself in very difficult circumstances. Where you will feel like slaves and prisoners, whether it's to your own issues or to others' abuse and torment. You will find the way to come up. And that's the strength that is given in these teachings. In these somewhat coarse and mundane teachings about slavery, is ultimately the message that you could always remember that no one can imprison your soul. Someone could try to harm your body, but who you are in your core and your essence should never be taken away. And therefore you can never take it away from somebody else either. You could never truly hold somebody as a prisoner. You could never truly own another person. You could never be a true slave owner. Because that person ultimately has their freedom, whoever they are. So I hope that this message, which is the message that I see in the story, is something that we could live with and remember every day of our lives. Yes, we may have our flaws, we may have those moments of inspiration, but at the same time we could remember that we are never enslaved to our surroundings or to our circumstances, but we always have the ability to rise up. L'chaim, l'chaim.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, if anyone wants to stay on and ask questions, have a good night, everybody. Thank you so much. But if anybody wants to stay on, you're welcome to ask any questions.
I was going to ask about when a Jewish person who is taken into, let's say, slavery, call it, and he stays for the seventh year, he has that chance to go it on his own. Could he not ask for a loan, sort of interest-free loan, so he doesn't necessarily have to decide to go, couldn't necessarily decide to go for another term with his master, because surely that's a bad option. Surely he should be free. His option is to be free and not do another term, as you say, for 50 years now.
Right.
I mean, so making the bad option, is that why they pierced his ear? Because he chose, it was the wrong choice.
That's right, 100%. So I don't know if maybe I missed it. That's the point that I wanted to say, and I think I may have missed that point. That he the reason why they take him to the doorpost and they pierce his ear, they're saying that it's a bad choice that you're making. You're already the servant of God, and by staying in this position, you're now, so to speak, God has given you your freedom. And by you choosing to be a slave, you're going against that freedom that God has given you. And that's why it's looked at negatively from a Jewish perspective, 100%. And another point is that the Torah does say that when you do free your slaves, you have to free them with gifts and money and the ability to move on with their lives. So yes, 100%, they do have that ability. But sometimes people are so engrossed or accustomed or addicted to their circumstances that they don't see the way out, and then therefore we take them. So why do we take them? By the way, the reason why it's taken to the door we pierce the ear, and I think I may have missed this point out in my rush to get to the other points. The reason why that happens is, we're told, it takes it to the doorpost to remind us of the night the Jewish people were redeemed from Egypt, that they had to pour blood on paint the doorposts, and then they heard at Mount Sinai that you are my servants and not the servants of others. So we take them to remind them of their freedom, and we also remind them that they heard on Mount Sinai that that you are my servants, and that's taken it to remind them, and they're still choosing it. So when they get that reminder, they may decide, hold on a second, you know what, this is not the right thing for me. And that's why it's not just done, it's actually done with a physical piercing of the ear. It's not just we tell them, you know that you're not a slave, we actually do an action. You know, in Judaism, we don't just like to talk, we like to act. It's for every idea there's an action. So the idea of you are free is by taking them physically to the doorpost and showing this is why it represents your freedom. And then your ear, you heard it on Mount Sinai. We don't just say it to them, we do an action to say, remind yourself, listen, you're a free man, you're a God's servant. You're there to do a higher purpose. It's like why in Judaism do we tear? And why do we sit on low stools and we're anonymous after a person passes away? Because by not just saying the comfort or saying things of mourning, by actually doing physical things that brings out those emotions from inside, because we believe that every action also has a emotion that's connected to it. Okay. Any other questions or points?
Namaskar. Thank you very much. Good you.
No problem.
Laila
Thank
tov.
you. Laila tov.
Thank you very much.
Yochanan, thank you.
Yochanan Barak. Bye, Irene.
Thank you for joining.
Bye,
Have a
Irene.
wonderful week. Enjoy the heat.
Okay, it's really hot.
It's pretty hot over here,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm assuming it's hotter by you, but it's pretty hot over here.
Oh, I think it's actually cooler up here on where I am and where you are at the moment. From what I'm hearing, my daughter says she couldn't even go out. It was too
Yeah,
hot.
it's been very hot lately.
Yeah, 32 or more, I think, 33, wasn't
Yeah.
It was 35 tomorrow, so
it?
Oh,
Wow.
wow.
good
Yeah.
day for fishing.
Good,
I
good
had to
idea.
clean my pool, so I woke up early this morning. I cleaned it in the morning because I know, like during the day, it ain't happening, and then you can't use it because
Well done, good move.
anyway, it gets too hot.
Yeah.
All right,
Bye.
see you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.